Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise tonight in the House to return to a question I asked on February 5th of the Prime Minister. February 5th shouldn't seem like so long ago, but it was when conversations about Kinder Morgan were less tinged with hysteria than they are today. I think it's a shame that we've descended into sort of a tit-for-tat competition without regard to the facts. I want to focus on facts, and that's what I did in my question on February 5th when I put it to the Prime Minister that the use of the figure 15,000 jobs is what was at stake in building Kinder Morgan was an exaggeration which even Kinder Morgan had never suggested. I've decided in the few moments allowed to me now, my 4 minutes, to put forward the 5 top whoppers of claims about Kinder Morgan that are not factually correct, and hope I have time to add some facts of what is correct. 15,000 jobs is something that's repeated often. I don't know where it came from. Kinder Morgan's submission to the National Energy Board put forward that they would have the creation of their project would create a grand total of 2,500 jobs a year for 2 years. They never asserted more than that, and they asserted 90 permanent jobs. So I don't know, there's no multiplier factor I can find that comes to 15,000 permanent jobs, 2,500 jobs a year in construction for 2 years. Secondly, repeated quite often, is the idea that this pipeline has been operated by Kinder Morgan since 1953, shipping dilbit with no problems. Two problems with that statement. In 1953, the pipeline was run by a different company, TransCanada, and it was shipping a different product, crude, not dilbit. Until Kinder Morgan took it over and bought it in the early 2000s, starting by 2004, 2005, very small amounts of bitumen mixed with diluent started to be shipped. This is a substance that has specific problems that are very different from crude. So, third point that keeps being claimed. Dilbit's just like crude, anyone can clean it up. We know this isn't true because of a spill that happened in an Enbridge pipeline in Kalamazoo, Michigan. That was the first time that even people like me who were dubious about pipelines realized that shipping diluted bitumen was an entirely different matter than shipping crude. Dilbit in the Kalamazoo River separated, the diluent floating to the surface and making the neighborhoods surrounding it sick. It was the symptoms of human illness that alerted Enbridge that they had a pipeline break because they had systematically shut off all the alarms as they went off in the control room. And then the bitumen sank to the floor of the river. The studies on bitumen and diluent fall into different categories. The ones done approximating ocean conditions, such as at the Bedford Institute for Oceanography in Halifax, show that in actual ocean water with sand and bits of seaweed and so on, when the diluent separates, the bitumen forms oil balls around particulates, and then it sinks. If you, however, fill a tank full of fresh water in Alberta and add in salt and do your studies there, they are able to report that bitumen mixed with diluent will float, at least for a while, till the diluent floats away. The next big whopper is that there's a $73 billion benefit to the Canadian economy over 20 years. That comes from a study by a company called Muse Stencil. Kinder Morgan submitted that in the NEB process. It was thoroughly reviewed by economists working for the City of Vancouver, who found that it was fatally flawed. A conclusion also reached by a Minnesota public government review of a report by the same company. They found that their assumptions and their data were unrealistic and unreliable. And lastly, in my last 7 seconds, the claim that we lose $40 million a day, totally false.
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Services and Procurement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With all respect to my colleague from Saanich Gulf Islands, I'm going to have to do this evening as I'm filling in for my esteemed colleague, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources. I listened with interest to the member's remarks and her efforts at myth-busting with respect to Kinder Morgan, and I suspect, I don't know that she cited sources for any of this information, but what I do know is that this government has taken a very rigorous approach to its approval of pipelines, has taken a science-based approach. We are in fact debating further enhancements to that, but this government, in a surfeit of caution, added a layer of suspenders and belt, if you will, to the approval of the Kinder Morgan pipeline by appointing a review panel. That review panel led, coupled with the NEB approval, led the government to approve this pipeline. And I think the rest is history. There are certainly ferocious arguments being made on the side of environmentalists. There are certainly ferocious arguments being made, for example, by conservatives in favor of the pipeline. We choose to take these projects on their merits, using science and using evidence, and basing ourselves in the knowledge that the environment and the economy are not a choice, that we can have the prosperity generated by a modern natural resource industry, one that has multiple points of access to global markets, that does not leave hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars on the table, or jobs on the table, and money out of the Canadian economy. We choose to have that growth, all the while making sure that our environment and the environmental safeguards that go with the construction of such projects, but also with the more general framework on climate change that our government is putting forward, where we tax carbon pollution and we therefore tax something we don't want, and hopefully see returned the proceeds of that to foster activities that we do want, whether it be innovation in the green economy, or whether it be income, or whether it be other sorts of things, as provincial governments and others see fit. So, Mr. Speaker, I think we've struck a very useful, constructive, and productive balance with respect to the Kinder Morgan pipeline. I don't know that the arguments on either side of the extremes of this argument are particularly helpful when you have a science-based, evidence-based approach that seeks to reconcile the environment and the economy, create prosperity for Canadians, create jobs in our energy sector and beyond, and also make sure that Canada retains its leadership role as a participant in the war on climate change, and more generally, a leader at the vanguard of environmental protection the world over. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will go to sources in the time I have remaining. The source that there is not 15,000 jobs but 2,500 over 2 years comes from Volume 5 of the submission of Kinder Morgan to the National Energy Board. I also direct the Parliamentary Secretary to the submissions from Unifor and the Alberta Federation of Labour that Kinder Morgan threatens jobs, information the NEB refused to hear. Secondly, that Kinder Morgan has been shipping only since it was created, can be found on any site, but that the Dilbit cannot be cleaned up. I refer the honourable member to the report of the Royal Society of Canada Expert Panel and the American Academy of Sciences. To the question of the exaggerated claims of financial benefit, I refer him to a report from Minnesota Department of Commerce and the evidence of Vancouver, which can be found in an article April 11th in the Tyee by Andrew Nikiforuk titled Kinder Morgan's Blackmail. The sources are hyperlinked to that article. Lastly, $40 million a day. Google Robin Allen Scotiabank report, a fantasy, and you will find all the sources there.